Hi, Trinity family. We're kicking off our series on Heroes of the Faith. And so as we started this series, I thought we needed to start with the hero of the faith that the Bible tells us. In the New Testament, there's all these different places where Abraham is labeled as sort of the epitome of the hero of faith. He kind of encapsulates this virtue of faith. And so we wanted to start with Abraham in the epistles of Paul, in the letter of James and Hebrews. Abraham is held up as this example for us of what it means to trust God completely. And so we want to start by telling his story. So what I'm going to do is, in each of these videos, give you just an overview of the life of the hero. And then in your community groups or on your own, you'll be looking at a specific passage that sort of encapsulates the virtue that this hero has. It's something they have to teach us, an example they have for us today. So the first thing to say about the life of Abraham is that Abraham's call to be a hero of the faith didn't actually start with him. It started with his father, Terah. And Terah was called out of Ur of the Chaldeans by God to go to the promised land, to Canaan. And so here's a map. I just want to show you where they set out, and Terah, his father, leads them out. And you'll notice that they're following along the Euphrates River Valley, Tigris and Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent. They're following along where there's a water source as they travel along to Canaan. And they get to a place called Haran. And what ends up happening is they settle there. They don't actually continue on their journey. And Genesis 11 tells us a story about them traveling along, and they end up settling in Haran. So that's where Abraham is when he receives a divine intervention call to go to the promised land, to become the father of the faith. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. We've all sang the song. And that's what Genesis 12 tells us about how Abraham is called to leave Haran and finish the journey to the promised land and become a great nation. It says a great nation so that Abraham will be a blessing to the nations. Genesis 12:3 says, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." That's the great promise that God has to do in Abraham's life. So Abram went. That phrase, so Abram went. He's in Haran and he gets called to go to the promised land. And it just says, so Abram went. And as you read through the life of Abraham, that phrase gets repeated over and over and over again. So Abram went. God tells him to go somewhere and he does it. And the virtue often associated with Abram is faith. And that's right. That's what we're talking about. But it was faith that was put into action through obedience. That Abram wasn't content to just believe God, but he actually did what God said to do. And we see that over and over again. This is what he has to teach us. That it's not just knowing the right thing to do, but actually doing it and putting it into action. Now, that doesn't mean that Abram was perfect. He had many flaws. There are two occasions where he actually says that Sarah, his wife, is his sister and hands her off to another man because he's so afraid, because she's really beautiful and he doesn't want people killing him to get his wife. And so he says, oh, this is my sister. Sure, take her. So he wasn't a great person and he had many failings. And both he and Sarah doubt God's promise that he is going to give them a child, that he is actually going to become the father of many nations. And so as we read through the life of Abram, over and over again, God has to remind them of the promise quite forcefully and say, no, I am going to do this. Look at the sand and the seashore. Look at the stars in the sky. I am going to give you descendants. You are going to be a blessing to the nations. He has to remind them over and over and over again. And he even changes Abram's name to Abraham, from Abram, which means father, to Abraham, which means father of peoples, that he's going to father peoples. And eventually, God follows through on this promises. In Genesis 21, Isaac is born. And it's this great culmination that because Abram has continued to cling to his faith in God, continue to trust him and be obedient to what God tells him to do, that is fulfilled in having Isaac. But then all that turns in Genesis 22 when God says to Abraham now, that he wants him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And Abraham, just like he did back in Genesis 12, so Abram went. He went to sacrifice his son in the land of Moriah on the altar that he constructed up on that mountain. But God doesn't require him to sacrifice his son. Instead, God is doing something very different. God is testing Abram's faith to see if he would obey, and he does. He passes the test. But God was actually doing something far greater than that. Because yes, God did not require Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. But one day, God would sacrifice his own beloved son, Jesus Christ, on the cross, not just in our place, but in the place of every sinner who's come before. In the place of Isaac, that Abraham was obedient. Just in the same way that Abraham was obedient, Jesus is obedient to go to the cross and die for the sins of the whole world. And we see a little prefiguring of this, a little hint. And I love this. I want to just close with this because I think it's such a cool way to understand what God was doing in and through the life of Abraham. And it comes earlier. It's a little snippet. It's almost like God gave Abraham a foretaste of what was going to come, the culmination of his faith and how he would have so many descendants. There's a story about a guy named Melchizedek. And I just want to read this story to you. Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, appears before Abraham. It says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. That's interesting. Melchizedek was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Already, God was prefiguring, giving us a type of Jesus and revealing that to Abram, that one day there would be somebody who would come, who would be the king of righteousness, that would make everything right, that would lay down his life, make the sacrifice, and that we would be reminded of that sacrifice in bread and wine every week. So that's Abram. That's the life of a hero of the faith, the hero of faith, who always went when God said to go, who trusted God completely, even to the point of being willing to sacrifice his own son, so that we could have an example of what it means to follow God with our whole lives. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great study.